did say 15, right?
In 5, 4, 3.
Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Newsam's Night TV studio and another edition of Inside Media. I'm your host, John Maynard. At the inauguration of Dwight D. Eisenhower in 1953, former President Harry S. Truman greeted another former president, Herbert Hoover. "I think we ought to organize a former president's club," Hoover suggested. "Fine," Truman replied. "You be the president of the club, and I'll be the secretary." And while the two ex-presidents may have been half joking, in truth, a new fraternity, perhaps the world's most exclusive fraternity, was born. The new book, The President's Club, looks back at the history of this exclusive fraternity and draws on newly revealed documents and hundreds of interviews to reveal the bond between these men. Today we are joined by the authors of this fascinating book, Michael Duffy and Nancy Gibbs, both of Time magazine. Michael is a Time executive editor who directs coverage of presidents, politics, and national affairs for Time. He joined the magazine in 1985 as a Pentagon correspondent, and ever since has covered Congress, the White House, national politics, and national security. Nancy is deputy managing editor of Time. She also joined the magazine in 1985 as a fact checker, and since her tenure there has authored more than 150 cover stories for Time magazine. She's covered nearly every major news event from Oklahoma City bombings to Hurricane Katrina, as well as the last 5 presidential campaigns. I should also note this is not the first time the two have teamed up. Their book, The Preacher and the Presidents, Billy Graham in the White House, was a 2007 New York Times bestseller. Please welcome Michael Duffy and Nancy Gibbs. So you obviously enjoyed each other's company enough with the first book that you decided to collaborate on this one. Tell us how the idea came together for the President's Club, Nancy.
It actually was born of the first book. One of the things that drew us to Billy Graham's political life was being fascinated that somehow this one highly prominent evangelical preacher had these long-standing, very personal friendships with one president after another, and they often used him to send messages to one another. Okay. And in the course of that research, we got very interested in this very small, very tight fraternity and started sort of putting aside little notes to ourselves that we got to come back and take a look at this and see what's really going on.
I have a somewhat different recollection.
Okay.
Here we go.
We were writing the Billy Graham book together, and Nancy's chapters, we split them in half, were effectively finished, and mine were not. And I was just really beginning to start writing my half when Nancy called one day and said, "We're doing the wrong book." Oh. And so, and which was great, but I got to finish the wrong book before we can do the right book. Right. So it did grow out of the first book, but that's my recovered memory of the whole thing.
This one go a little smoother than the last one, also, or?
Yeah, I think it did.
Yeah. Okay. I did mention.
I think it did.
Okay. I'm going to move on.
Yes, it did.
Yes, there you go.
You got to finish. Okay. It's really
now,
good.
I did mention the half-joking comment between Truman and Hoover, but in truth, that was the official start of the club. But really, 1945 was when it sort of unofficially started. Is that correct? When
that encounter at that inauguration was the end of what was an extraordinary and unlikely friendship. Truman at one point said, "There's no conversation so sweet as that between former political enemies." And you can't imagine two politically more opposite people than Truman and Hoover. And yet, in 1945, in the spring, when Truman suddenly takes office and has a world of problems he has to solve, one of the biggest ones is what is he going to do about what was then a growing humanitarian crisis in Europe because of the devastation of the war. And unfortunately for Truman, the guy who knew the most about what to do was the guy who had been thrown out of Washington 12 years earlier, the most hated man in America. Right. And so Truman secretly mails Hoover a letter. You know, Hoover, who Woodrow Wilson had used as his big food troubleshooter, who really knew how to do this. He was an engineer by training. And Truman didn't care that he was, as he described him, to the right of Louis XIV. You know, this is the guy that I need. Brings him into the White House, the two guys talk, and from there, this remarkable partnership is born. So by the time they actually formed their club at Ike's inauguration, they've done all sorts of business together that has been extremely productive.
Right. We have a picture from the book of Truman and Hoover. I believe that's 1962 or so. Did Hoover's career kind of resurrect itself because of Truman reaching out to him?
It did,
Yeah.
and it's an irony now where we've seen how presidential reputations rise and fall long after they're gone by, Hoover went from being so reviled to being in the top 5 of Gallup's list of most admired men by the time Truman is leaving office. So he really did. At one point when he was asked how he had managed to get past all of the critics of his policies during the Depression, he just said, "I outlived the bastards."
One of the features of the club that's important, and the reason it exists and needs to exist, is all of the presidents come out of office with scars and welts and bruises, and some more than others, but some need for redemption. And because they enter this fraternity of other guys, and so far it's only guys, who also need some redemption, they find some solace there and some understanding that they really can't find anywhere else.
Right. We're going to get into some more of the relationships between the presidents, but one of the great facts I learned reading the book was that the club does indeed have a clubhouse right across from the White House in Lafayette Square. Tell us about this place, first of all, and how you learned about it.
Michael was the first reporter, and I think only reporter, who's ever actually been inside, and I will never forget the day he called me and said, basically, "You won't believe what I found."
Yeah. What'd you see?
Well, I was interviewing an aide of several former presidents who said that he had been working recently on a club-related project, and I thought, we were still kind of thinking of the club as a construct of our own, not a real thing. And I said, "What club-related project?" And he said, "Well, we're trying to raise money for a place called Trowbridge House, which is at 715 Jackson Place, a part of Lafayette Square. It's owned by the, on that sort of rehabilitated west side of the square. And it was created by Richard Nixon. In 1969, Lyndon Johnson had retired to the banks of the Pedernales, but was constantly calling Nixon for lots of reasons, asking for planes and trains and cars and escorts and a hotel in Washington, workspace. And finally Nixon, who had lots of reasons we go into in the book later to keep Johnson nice and happy, quiet, quiescent, finally said to a young military aide, "Just find him a place." Nixon had gone to the trouble of actually creating an assistant to the president for former presidents. And he had. And the young military aide who got the job to scarf up the office space, and it turned out to be a hostel, was Colonel Brent Scowcroft, who then would go on to serve some of the men who would become president. Wow. So he found the space, and that's still there 40 years later. It's a very nice Four Seasons kind of. You'd be very comfortable there tonight if you were able to check in, but you can't.
Tell us some other surprises that you learned putting together this book. You got the clubhouse. What other revelations?
I think one of the things that surprised us most was that presidents from different parties get along a lot better than presidents from the same party. It's almost, the more different they are, generationally, ideologically, the easier time they have finding some common ground, which just completely violated our expectations, as did a lot of things. But what we discovered, whether it's Reagan and Nixon or Clinton and Carter, is that presidents from the same party are often rivals in a different way for how history will perceive them. You could even argue that about Bill Clinton and Barack Obama, who are in a way in a wrestling match over which of them is going to be remembered as the guy who managed to move the country in a more progressive direction through which one's sense of navigational talent. And so whereas presidents from opposite parties, we again and again we found these alliances that we never expected, starting obviously with Truman and Hoover, but going up to how Bill Clinton ends up calling Richard Nixon late at night to talk not just about China, but about his daily schedule and exercise routine. Right.
Yeah, I do want to get to them. Let's move on to our, this is a very famous photo, of course, of John Kennedy with Eisenhower following the Bay of Pigs. This is them in Camp David. This is actually hangs in our Pulitzer Prize photo gallery down on the first floor. But he did turn to Eisenhower following that. What was the significance of this historic meeting?
That was a picture that President Kennedy very much needed to have in the newspapers. He, 4 months into his presidency, has this disaster at the Bay of Pigs, and he calls Eisenhower and asks him to come to Camp David. And while the two men, that conversation that you're seeing was a tough conversation, and Eisenhower really grilled him about how the decision-making had gone, why it had gone so badly awry. When they faced reporters afterwards, Eisenhower was so supportive that the headline in the New York Times the next day was Eisenhower urges country to support Kennedy on Cuba. And resisted all requests from Republicans in Congress who came to see him that weekend and said, look, great, the honeymoon's over, we can finally take the gloves off. He's like, no, 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 no. I don't want any witch hunting. The president needs to be able to conduct a foreign policy, and he needs the country to be united behind him, because this is a very dangerous time.
This picture is particularly ironic because it's Kennedy's first trip to Camp David. That would be Camp David, named after Eisenhower's father and grandson. So it really was a passing of the torch, a literal trip to the woodshed.
Right, right. Yep. After Kennedy's assassination, Johnson ended up calling Eisenhower the best chief of staff I've had. That works for me. Talk about the Eisenhower-Johnson relationship.
Johnson would call Eisenhower and ask him to make up a cover story for why he needed to come to Washington so he could slip over to the White House and consult with him. There was one meeting that of the national security team that Johnson was running late to. Eisenhower just started the meeting and basically ran the thing. It was extraordinary how much Johnson, I think, trusted and respected Eisenhower's judgment as he was trying to figure out what to do in Vietnam. Johnson's domestic policy sense was so exquisitely acute. He was much less secure about his foreign policy instincts, and so his dependence on Eisenhower was really remarkable to see.
But also a little bit tragic, because Johnson was so keen to make it clear to Eisenhower that they had a relationship. He once went to the trouble of having his aides dig up every time in 35 years or something he'd even met the guy, been in the room with him, been in a picture with him when he was way back, a staffer in the Congress. So that he was really keen to be linked to Eisenhower, and yet the advice Eisenhower would give him in those military skull sessions was oftentimes far more hawkish than Johnson's instincts, or even Ike's advice to his own folks when he was president. So it actually may have deepened Johnson's inclination in the war.
Right. You mentioned Richard Nixon, and that's one president, you wouldn't expect really maybe to be part of the club after, resigning from office, but he winds up being influential every presidency until his death in 1994. Tell us about why the presidents, and there he is with President Bush at the time, why did they keep going back to Nixon?
Well, no one launched the same sort of 20-year redemption tour that Nixon launched after he left Washington, and Ford could have very little to do with him. Carter wanted nothing to do with him. Reagan was the first to really listen to him, take his advice. They had a lengthy, lifelong exchange of letters that went back to 1947, before either was president. That is quite interesting and is in the book. They had been rivals, and so Nixon got his first sort of taste of redemption with Reagan. But with Bush, it was a different relationship. It was more mentor-mentee. And Bush found it much more difficult to resist Nixon's bad advice and instincts than Reagan had. And there were times when Bush is president where Nixon is so keen to reestablish himself as a foreign policy expert, because of course he didn't want to try to reestablish himself on domestic policy, that he runs right over Bush and drives Bush up a wall, and Bush yet is too polite, just way too polite, to sort of smash him, which is what he needed to do, but he wouldn't do it. And those are very poignant chapters. Bush's understanding of Nixon and his problems is exquisitely sensitive. He knows all the problems with the guy, but he's simply too well-mannered to put him in his place.
And then you write about the unexpectedly close relationship between these two gentlemen, Bill Clinton and Richard Nixon. But I think you're right, there's a letter that Nixon wrote to Clinton that he reads. I don't know if he still reads it every year, but certainly read it every year during his presidency. Tell us about it.
I really want this to be the HBO movie of the book, if there is one.
Yeah.
When Clinton is elected, it's the golden age of the President's Club. There are 5 former living presidents, the most since
Lincoln.
Abraham Lincoln. 5, amazing, because of course they were electing them earlier, we're kicking them out of office faster, and they're living longer. And they all want to get to know Clinton, but no one is so desperate to get to know Clinton as Nixon. He's literally practically standing on the Pennsylvania Avenue, waving his arm, saying, "Call me." And Clinton won't call, because who wants to talk to Dick Nixon if he just got elected as the first Democrat since Carter? So Nixon engages in a series of unbelievably twisted things to get Clinton's attention, all kinds of stuff. Finally, Clinton calls him 3 months later. They become late-night phone buddies. They talk about, as you hinted, not just foreign policy, but how do you do this job. And a month before he dies, Nixon sends Clinton a 7-page single-space letter about Russia. And this has never been released, this letter, though pieces have been. And when we went to see Clinton to talk about this and the other relationships, he quoted at length from that Nixon letter. And we said, how do you remember that quote? And he goes, I get that letter out every year and reread it. Which tells you about the bond that even two guys who have nothing in common, well, not nothing, but, little in common, share.
Yeah, at one point, Clinton likened it, after Nixon died, to the death of his mother, and how sometimes, he would sort of reach for the phone, wish he could pick it up and call him, and then remember that he couldn't. I mean, in a way, you could say this was Clinton's Nixon to China, that it was easier for a Democratic president to actually be known to be talking to Nixon than it had been for his Republican predecessors.
Well, this book really is full of unexpected relationships, and one that really stood out to me is between George Bush Sr. and the man who booted him out of office, Bill Clinton. I think we have a picture of them. There they are with, obviously, President Ford and Carter, and we can talk about this meeting too, but you have a great line in the book that Clinton and Bush Sr. became so close they were an item.
I didn't write. Did you write that? That's really clever.
Yeah.
I don't remember writing that at all. They again, across party lines, easier than within. Carter and Clinton could never have had no moment of peace between them in 30 years. They were fighting virtually from the day they first met, and so it just somehow something about the differences it leaves them with more to discover about the other. But the Bush 41 Clinton thing is, inside the fraternity, there's a paternity. And the old man not only has his own son in the club, he's got the surrogate son. And, Barbara Bush wasn't kidding when she said Bill Clinton is her husband is the father Bill Clinton never really had. And you know that the Bush family has embraced Bill Clinton because they've conferred on him the highest possible honor in the Bush family, which is to give him a nickname. And his nickname is Brother from Another Mother. The club is getting to be a pretty interesting place.
Yeah.
We're sort of looking forward to the fantasy potential of an intra-club smackdown. The Hillary Clinton, Jeb Bush, 2016.
It's going to be great for paperback sales.
There you go. I want to stay on this photo also because we do see Jimmy Carter, one ex-president that seemed to rile up the others, could be quite a troublemaker. Give us some of the instances, certainly some of his overseas trips where he kind of
Well, before he got around to troublemaking, he also modeled for them. So Carter leaves office still a very young man with, and he's sort of depressed. He's got his whole life ahead of him. And he has been known to say that he's a much better former president than he was president, which in a way is easy. He's had 7 times as much time to be a former president. This September, on September 7th, he became the longest serving former president in American history.
Oh, okay.
Past Herbert Hoover, 31 years.
8 months, 21 days.
Okay. So Carter is the one who really invented the modern post-presidency, and it's a model that all the others in varying degrees have followed, with founding the Carter Center, becoming a kind of global troubleshooter on border disputes and election monitoring and disease eradication. So there's all of that on one side of the ledger. On the other hand, he also has a way of saying that he's been a better former president than the other former presidents. That's the part maybe they're not so crazy about.
Well, on the other hand, every club needs a black sheep.
Yeah.
Gives the members something to talk about.
But there are some instances where he did go rogue.
Oh,
correct?
just as Richard Nixon went rogue on Lyndon Johnson in ways that Johnson found treasonous in 1968, Jimmy Carter was sent to North Korea by Bill Clinton and did cut deals with. He was just sent to go over and find information. Within 24 hours, he's cut a whole new deal for the United States, and he announced it on CNN before telling Clinton.
Yeah.
And the people in the White House were climbing the walls. On another trip Clinton sent Carter on, before Carter came back to report, this was to Haiti, and about a year later, Carter goes on CNN before coming back to the White House, and when he finally gets there, the men almost had to be separated. It was very, very unpleasant. Again, men from the same party struggle with this bond more than men from different parties.
Tell us the story of Carter and Ford and how they broke the ice after a very chilly relationship.
Well, it's astonishing because it happened at 35,000 feet. Both men were sent by Ronald Reagan along with Dick Nixon, talk about a weird trip, to Cairo for the funeral of Anwar Sadat in October 1981. The trip over is just strange because Al Haig and Henry Kissinger and Stevie Wonder are all on the plane. It's tiny, noisy, crowded 707. And on the way back, those folks all kind of peel off, and it's kind of just Ford and Carter. And even though they had this very tough fight in '76, they hadn't talked really in 5 years. They get to talking. Nixon's gone, so kind of the mood's lighter. And they realize they have more in common than what separates them. They have to both raise money. They both have to tend to their libraries. They both don't like Ronald Reagan. That's enough to build a friendship on. And they do. And over the next 25 years, they would do 25 projects together. It's kind of the list Nancy had, but a lot at home, arms control, budget stuff. And they would vow to each other within just a few years that each would give the eulogy at the funeral of the other, depending on who died first. An honor that fell to Carter in 2006.
Right. I do want to get to questions in just a moment. I just want to go through two more kind of stories. And I think we do have a gentleman with, do you have a microphone? Perfect. So if you have a question, please raise your hand. He'll try to trot over to you and get you on the mic. But we have a picture here. This is, I believe, oops, we'll go back to that. But that's obviously Inauguration Day, I believe, and they're both in the office. You would think this would be the strongest bond of all, strongest sort of connection, but not really the case, correct? From your
You have to do that one.
Well, you know, politics is complicated, but it is nothing compared to family. And, you know, as many, tomes have been written about the mad Oedipal drama that we saw played out of the son, always trying to follow in the father's footsteps, not quite filling them, and a presidency designed to compensate for, that what we actually were struck by, and particularly Michael's interviewing, having covered both Bush White Houses, really brought home was that it was not nearly so much how the father-son relationship affected the presidency. It was how the presidency affected the father-son relationship. And what the younger President Bush found was, he said at some point, the criticism that was flying at him as Iraq went bad, as his presidency started to shudder, that was really driving the dad crazy. And Barbara Bush would call her son and say, "You got to tell your father to stop watching TV." And so Bush the younger would call home and say, "Dad, really, I'm fine. You don't have to worry about me. Everything's cool." And he said, you know, he became the comforter.
Right.
And all of these dynamics between father and son were, you know, I think that you only get one dad, and that was the thing that they understood. Presidents have plenty of advisors. You only have one dad.
Right.
And that was much more what that relationship was about.
Right. Apparently this was a very emotional moment too. They couldn't even speak in that while they were in the same office that day, which you talk about in the book. I'm going to show one of my favorite pictures, and this you might recognize. This was in the museum last year. During our
Okay, that's a beautiful thing.
Pictures of the Year exhibit.
I see that one go over.
I mean, Clinton's expression and Obama's expression is
I'm back.
Yeah, I'm back. Exactly. And you talk about this in the book. This is the moment Clinton kind of was with Obama talking up his new tax cut package.
You know,
I believe.
when this event happened, I knew he was on our side in the book. He was doing everything he could to help us. This was in December. It's about 2 years ago, December 2010. Really early in that month, Obama's just had been shellacked in the midterms, and he's cutting another deal for tax cuts, or a deal with tax cuts with the Republicans. And he's looking. He calls. He's having a bad day. He's having kind of a club day. Earlier that afternoon, he called officials from the Reagan era and said, "Will you come talk to me?" And they asked him, how did Reagan cope with difficulty? How did Reagan deal with setbacks? Did he show that? Did he hold it in? I mean, he's wrestling now with both the public and the private aspects of the presidency and looking for guidance from his predecessors. He's literally trying to invoke the ghost of Reagan by bringing in the formers. And then a real former shows up, and he's asking Clinton to say, would you do this deal? Can you help me sell this deal if I have to do it? He has to do it because the Republicans are going to force it on him. And Clinton says, it's the best deal you're going to get. Do you want me to make some calls? And Obama says, no, I want you to come to the briefing room and say that. And so he does. What we don't know that is going to happen when this picture is taken is that after 20 minutes, Obama has to go to a party. And he says, I got to go now. And Clinton says, okay, you go. Say hi to Michelle for me. And Clinton then conducts another 20 minutes worth of press conference. I mean, it is like Back to the Future. Now, we loved this, but I'm not sure Obama did.
Yeah. And famously this summer, Clinton, went to bat for Obama with that memorable convention
and the
speech.
bow.
Right.
But it's not all kumbaya between them. I mean, he did 16 or 17 events in 18 days. It probably made a huge difference in this race, I think. Certainly that convention moment was incandescent. And I think the Clintons made a decision sometime in midsummer that Obama was going to win. They wanted to be part of it. That's not just because of now, it's because of later. And did, and were a big part of that. But they are rivals. They both have very different ideas about how to advance a progressive agenda in a nation that is essentially center-right. They have very different ideas about how to do that, and both have written about their differences. And so while there is some shared purpose, it isn't all shared.
Right. Again, we do want to get to questions, so if anyone does have a question, please just raise your hand. We have a gentleman there, and I think we have our first question on that fourth row there.
I love that picture.
It's a great shot, yes.
Very little mention, is this on?
I think so.
Very little mention of the latter Bush in this discussion, except for the one picture of the two, father and son. Is that significant somehow in the way the book gets told, or in what you found?
There's a great picture that we use in the book of that takes place in the last weeks that George W. Bush was in office, when he invited the club to gather at Obama's request. He wanted to meet the crew, and so all five of them, two Bushes, Clinton, Carter, Obama, all together in the Oval Office. And at that time, President Bush says to President Obama, we all want you to succeed. And whether we're Democrats or Republicans, we all understand that this office transcends the individual. And since then, he has, with enormous discipline, stuck to that principle. And he said at the outset, President Obama deserves my silence. And on the occasions when he's appearing in various forums or talking about policy, and someone basically invites him to criticize Obama's economic policy or his energy policy or whatever, whatever President Bush says is then immediately followed by something along the lines of, but I don't think it's good for our country to undermine our president, and I don't intend to do so.
Just like Ike said about Kennedy, in a way.
Yeah.
It's a very protective club, right? Protecting the power.
Protecting the
power.
office itself. We came to think of it as almost a shadow secret service, where their belief, having been in the job, is that for America to be safe and to prosper, it needs a strong presidency. And so when Gerald Ford tried to secretly help cut a deal to forestall Bill Clinton's impeachment, it was not because he was particularly concerned with saving Clinton's skin. It was because he worried about what he called the majesty of the office being damaged by a prolonged and ugly Senate trial. We saw that again and again and again, that what President Bush said was very much in line with what earlier presidents had believed and acted on.
I think we had a question right in the front row there. Thank you.
If you had an opportunity to interview one to two team of presidents, either living or dead, who would it be and what would you ask them?
Great question.
Interviewed together or individually?
Your choice.
I've interviewed all mine.
Yeah, I had the easier job. I did the dead president, so my interviews were much easier. We both came away, I think, feeling that if we were to be, trapped in a log cabin, someone asked us once, if you were trapped in a log cabin on a snowy night with one of them, who would it be? And one of the things that is so striking about Lyndon Johnson is the unbelievable gift he had as a storyteller, as someone who really was larger than life. And it was such a frustration to his biographers and speechwriters that he would not let them capture his vernacular, that he thought it made him sound like a rube. He was very self-conscious about that, and he would scrub all of the the speeches and the memoirs of anything that actually captured this incredible gift that he had for storytelling. I also think Johnson is such an enormous, heroic, tragic, fascinating figure that having, for the last five or so years that we were living with these guys, I lived with Eisenhower for a while, I lived with Truman for a while, that it was hard to let go of Johnson because we never quite felt like we had gotten our arms around him. You?
Yeah, I mean, I think both of us, when we were doing the book, felt blessed repeatedly by how much there is to read and know between their tapes, advertent or inadvertent, their voluminous writings in the case of, say, Reagan, just amazing amount of stuff. Bush one, stunning. His book of letters is one of the great reads of all time. Douglas Brinkley wrote a whole book about the first 25 years of Carter's post-presidency, and it's been 8 years since then. So there's a lot to chew through and a lot where you get I think in terms of raw interest, I would love to interview Nixon, because he was obviously great in an interview, but in terms of the human sort of story, it's Johnson. Those two guys together are really the giants of the group.
Did you interview other living presidents?
In terms of mysteries.
Did you interview other living presidents for this book?
No, but over the space of my career, I've interviewed all
I
of
see.
them.
Okay.
And for this book, I think we talked to Carter, Clinton, Bush, and Nancy had done an interview with 43 in which the club was discussed a few years earlier. So we were lucky.
Okay. We have a few more questions here, right in the middle there. If you could just hand the mic down, that'd be terrific. Thank you. And then I think we're going to go up there.
At any point, did the club members sort of get together on a regular basis? I'm thinking like, the annual Christmas party kind of thing.
In a way, they do get together, but it's not regular. The club will gather in March in Dallas for the opening of the Bush 43 library. They will all go. That's a big deal inside the club. There are feast days like that. But there are also funeral days, days of mourning, and the club gathers on those occasions. They're in touch, though, all on a pretty regular, constant basis. On Thursday, it broke that George Herbert Walker Bush had been hospitalized. Now, it turns out he'd been in the hospital for a lot longer than that, maybe a week, with a really bad cough that he couldn't shake. But I was at a lunch, and I knew Thursday's past the magazine's deadline, but it doesn't really matter anymore since I'm told we live in a 24/7 news cycle. And so I knew that I had to find out quickly just how sick he was. So I quickly got out my BlackBerry and started to write 3 emails. And I sent the first one to Gene Becker, who's the President Bush's chief of staff, but I knew Gene would be busy. And then I sent one to his son's chief of staff, who I thought would know and maybe be a little bit less busy. But I knew that if I wanted the fastest answer on President Bush's condition, that if I wrote Bill Clinton's chief of staff a note, I would hear back within minutes, because he regards literally the man almost like the father we talked about a minute ago. And it was the fastest response. 3 or 4 minutes later, he's okay, it's just bronchitis. Wow. But it was a tough cough, and I think it was hard for him to shake. So, but they are in touch constantly. And the guidance from all 3 of them within 20 minutes was identical. And he's flirting with the nurses.
I think we had if you could get that mic down to the woman in the, go ahead.
I'm wondering about the First Ladies. Is there any intentional relationships, deliberate or between or among them?
We've now been traveling around for the last 6 months talking about this book, and that is at every single event, because it's the immediate question that you think about, is there a parallel First Ladies Club? And our sense is that while there is the similar shared sympathy, and when you talk also to presidential children, there is kind of a kids club too, where they are in touch with each other. Because they all have gone through this ordeal, right? They've lived in the fishbowl, and they will talk about how do you deal with that, with the security, with your teenager who's trying to shake her Secret Service agent, with the, so that camaraderie is there, but the element that is missing, that really is defining for the presidents, is how much of the union amongst them is born of pain that they have each experienced. And that has to do with the fact that every decision a president makes, by definition, is a hard decision. The easy ones get made lower down the food chain. And that means that there are always going to be regrets. Even if you made a decision with a good outcome, even if your presidency is judged successful, you still come out of it having made calls that you will live with for the rest of your life. And they stagger out of office with those scars that you can't complain about. You got to be the leader of the free world. No one's going to feel particularly sorry for you. But they understand in one another, and they understand what it's like to have to live with that. And that bond, both of the formers with the one in office and then amongst them when they're out, is so profound and unique to having sat in the chair.
Why don't we, yeah, I think I'll go there, yell it out, and then we'll get a mic for.
I asked them that because that's the heart of the story to me, the human story. It's not about the Middle East or, whether you liked, the solarium on the third floor. It's how do you move forward with our increasingly long life with these wealth, scars, and regrets and coulda, shoulda, wouldas, even when you're a success. And people are constantly asking you questions. Well, what about that, decision you made? And Bush 41 said, this is kind of the one place we go where we don't have to explain anything because we know. And I asked Jimmy Carter a version of it. Does the fact that you all have these regrets and welts and these burdens to carry for the rest of your life bind you together also? And he said, in I think a very candid, kind of Jimmy Carter candid way, we all have our sorrows. That was the Baptist preacher in him talking.
When I asked President Bush 43 whether, having been in this was maybe 2 or 3 weeks after his reelection in 2004, I said, okay, now you've been in the job for 4 years. Do you think any differently about any of your predecessors? Are there any that you now think more highly of, less highly of?
Clinton, you asked him specifically.
And specifically about Clinton. And he said, I think more highly of all of them. Even Clinton, yeah, more highly of all of them. Just because I know what they went through. I know what it's like to sit in the chair.
Wow. Gentleman with the mic up there.
Yes.
Yep, you're on.
Well, first of all, I just wanted to say thank you for writing the book. I enjoyed it immensely. And after reading it, quite often after taking on such a large project, most people, after it's completed, they take a last look at it. And I can't help to wonder if there was anything maybe that you would have changed about it after taking that look at it, or are you pretty happy with the complete outcome of it?
I will say that
Yeah, which is going with this.
you are, yeah. It's very exciting to work with Michael because he's a really, really good reporter. The problem is he's very scrupulous and very much I need more than one source, I need to be sure. And so in between when the book was closed and we couldn't touch it any longer and it was off at the printer and its publication date, a couple of really tantalizing, wonderful things that we didn't feel were completely nailed down, we were able to confirm, and Michael could call and say, okay, that really did happen. So Time Magazine put the story on the cover, and there were a bunch of things that we were able to put in the magazine story that are not in the book because the confirmation had come too late.
I was saving them.
Yeah.
We'll leave it at that. We have time for just a couple more questions, so we're going to get right here in the front row there.
I'm curious about both of your reactions to the buzz around town that the reason Clinton got so involved in the Obama campaign towards the end was to help lay the groundwork for Hillary running in 2016. So I'd be curious what you think of that.
Well, I think I said a minute ago that I think that they made a decision that he was going to win. I think they were always going to help. These are Democrats. That was inevitable. The question is how much. When Gerald Ford ran against Carter in '76, he thought he had a deal with Ronald Reagan to campaign a lot. Reagan, particularly in the South, Reagan said, "I'll help you," and then he only went to 4 or 5 events. I mean, Clinton was in there hammer and tong. I mean, he went to Ohio. I don't know how many times he went to Ohio. I've lost track. But it was 16 of 17 days or something like that. I think they really wanted to be part of the win. And I think that is absolutely, no doubt, as with everything else the Clintons have done, have really been excellent team players in the Obama. And I think Hillary will run. I think she'll be at the top of the Gallup polls by March. I think that's what they do. And so, but I think they wanted to be seen and yeah, sure, it's part of, and it certainly, I think the smart way to say it is certainly it allows them to have that option.
One last question there, if that's okay. Go ahead.
Hi,
Yeah.
in terms of this kind of protecting the majesty of, the office idea, do you feel that it goes one way? Because I feel like I see this, the previous presidents defending who's currently in office, but I don't see it going the other way. Mostly speaking about Obama had a lot of criticisms of President Bush. Do you think that it does go one way, or if so, why do you think it really does seem to kind of go one way?
Well, this is one of the great "I'll use you, you use me" clubs ever, and they all understand that they, just as Hoover and Truman were doing all kinds of great things in the 40s and 50s together, even as Truman was running against, Hoover in 1948. I mean, they were in team, but in public, Truman was just letting Hoover have it. And so there's some understanding that that's just politics. And the same was true, obviously, in certainly in 1992. So I think that's part of the deal. These guys understand that that's part of the game. Do you have thoughts about this that are smarter than mine, which aren't very smart?
No. Although I do think we've talked about this a little, about to the extent to which the Obama made some effort to keep it from being personal, and he obviously was continually talking about what he inherited and about where he disagreed fundamentally with President Bush's policies. But I think in that he was echoing what a fair number of Republicans were saying as well. And I think while there were exceptions, I think by and large he was not going to give President Bush a pass and say, I'm never going to criticize him, because so much of his presidency was trying to explain why aren't things getting better faster. And so he's continually referencing what came before. But I think trying to do it in a way that was not a personal attack.
My favorite example is in Charlotte, when Bill Clinton gave his speech on behalf of Obama. He said many nice things about George W. Bush in that speech, on foreign policy. Two different kinds of big shout-outs to Bush, one on Africa, one on something else I can't remember. We heard more nice things from Bill Clinton about George W. Bush in that 3 days in Charlotte than we heard about George W. Bush in all of the extra time in Tampa. It was just interesting.
The book is The President's Club, Inside the World's Most Inclusive Fraternity. I want to thank Nancy Gibbs and Michael Duffy for joining us here today.
Thank you. Thank you.
And a reminder that they will be selling copies of the book right outside the studio here. We hope to see you there. Tomorrow we have another Inside Media. It's a sports roundtable with ESPN pioneer John Walsh and George Solomon, former Washington Post sports editor. So we hope to see you back here tomorrow at 2:30. Thanks so much.